special meeting of the Board of Commissioners together to discuss the 2021 budget workshop, and in doing so, we'll say welcome to Ed Gagnon, who's going to be our facilitator once again and lead us through some discussion of our local economy, the 2021 budget development, and some of the things that we'll work with along with staff to get that done. So this time I'll turn it over to County Manager Mark Watson.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to thank each of you for spending time with staff this afternoon to kick off our annual budget process. We are beginning again this year with a work session designed as a check-in with the board and as an opportunity to provide some level-setting information to you. The information and feedback you provide today will be beneficial to staff throughout the county departments and agencies as they begin developing operating capital budgets that are aligned with the objectives of the organization. Today you're going to hear from Mr. Blake Hart, who's with us, our Director of Budget and Management. He has an economic update for you, as well as some information about our budget process. We also have Mr. Ed Gagnon with us again. He'll be facilitating the discussion about the budget process, the feedback that each of you have provided to him about the process that we had gone through previously earlier this year, as well as a review of the board's strategic objectives. Additionally, you'll be receiving information regarding potential budget workshop topics. I know that some of the feedback received by Ed and Blake was specific to Public Works, and I want to assure you we haven't forgotten about Public Works operating budgets. However, the board and staff have spent a great deal of time on Public Works issues over the past few weeks and months, and the action taken last week has moved us forward in terms of the rate structure that Public Works staff has to work with for the FY21 and 22 budget years. Our focus today is really on the general fund departments, and I hope that we can receive good feedback and direction for our staff to look toward as they start their work on the FY21 budget. The topic of tax rates generally comes up at this time of year, and I want to let you know the strategy I plan to work under regarding that. As I began to work with the management team on the manager's recommended budget, we will be focused on a recommendation that does not require a tax rate increase, with the exception of potentially the fire funding under the new district model that we'll be implementing. With that, I'll be glad to turn it over to Blake and Ed.
All right. Thank you, Mark. Thank you, County Manager Watson, Chairman Simpson, and other members of the Board of County Commission. I'm grateful to be here with you today, and look forward to walking you through some topics about our local economic condition, the economic condition of the national economy, the state economy, and how that flows down and affects us here in Union County. A quick agenda of the things that I hope to discuss. We get economic outlook, the financial status, our starting assumptions for our budget process for FY21. We're going to talk about how that feeds into the departmental target process. We'll look at the budget calendar, and then we'll look at a new initiative that we're looking at and we're working on, which is the performance management dashboards, which will be a way for management and board members and department directors to review their performance of their agencies and see how they're performing, if they're being efficient, effective, and timely in their service delivery. Before we get into the meat of the presentation, I want to draw us back to the strategic vision of the Board of County Commissioners. We know that as we start at the highest level, which is the board that gives us executive vision and direction over the long term as an organization, these are the objectives that have been put forward for this purpose. And I want to remind everybody that this is the skeleton or the framework that we're building our budget on. And everything that we do as an organization should flow back and tie into these strategic objectives in some way. And again, I want to look at the county manager's core values, which were outlined in his first budget last year, which are maintaining fiscal discipline, investing in core services, and strategic framework for internal business processes. These also will serve as a direction for us as we go forward and build the budget in FY21. So I was asked to do an economic overview to look at what we can expect, what influences our budget process, how will the national economy affect our local budget. I took a few data points and I thought we could walk through those quickly here just to share with you what I've been seeing in the news and in different reports from the federal government. Number one, you may have seen on Friday, the most recent jobs report was released from the Bureau of Labor Statistics, and it was very positive. It showed that the national economy added 266,000 jobs in the month of November, which greatly exceeded expectations, and was very positively viewed in the economic circles. The Conference Board, which is a nonpartisan think tank in Washington, D.C., that provides commentary on the economy, and also provides several surveys that are used to gather information from around the financial circles. Their comment on the jobs report was that it squashed lingering concerns about imminent recession. So that was a pretty profound comment they made based on some speculation that was around that there were some areas of the economy that weren't as strong as they might have wanted. We see also that the national unemployment rate is currently at 3.5%. It's the 21st consecutive month of having an unemployment rate at sub 4%, which is considered full employment. That's a very positive indicator of the local economy. The national economy, we look at the local economy. The local unemployment rate is 3.1%, so we're doing better than the national economy. And the state unemployment rate is 3.5% also, so we're beating the state and the national unemployment rate. We're doing well. We see that the U.S. economy is in the 11th year of economic expansion, coming out of the Great Recession, which it's hard to believe it's been 10 years or more since we went through that. But we've had economic expansion every month, every year since then, and that's a very positive indicator that we have to look at. We'll talk about that a little bit down below also, because that does raise some concern about how long can that last, how long can we expand before we start to contract a little bit. We see that the Dow Jones passed 28,000, which is a record level. That it passed 28,000, I believe, 2-3 weeks ago, and then it came down just under. And then with the release of the jobs report on Friday, it increased about 400 points to cross 28,000 again and kind of settle there. We see average hourly wages increasing at 3.1% year over year. So that means folks at all levels of the job market, folks at the lower end of the job market, folks at the higher end, are seeing their wages increase, and it's actually more pronounced at the lower end of wage earners. So folks that are just coming into the market, or those who are working to improve their skills, are benefiting most from that. A national survey that was conducted actually by the Conference Board also showed that 60% of employers plan to add positions in 2020, which is a great sign to show some positivity and some confidence in the economy for next year. And only 4% are planning to cut workers or to reduce their workforce, and that's a great ratio to have there as far as where CEOs plan to grow their businesses. There's strong competition for workers in the job market. This drives wages up for workers. We see this here in the county. The strong economy is making hiring new workers difficult because there's lots of competition. Workers have choices, and again, that has a general increase to wages and salaries. Many workers are coming back into the workforce. Retirees, parents, folks who are unskilled or are retraining to gain more skills, to be more productive and more marketable in the local workforce. I think we see this here as well in some of our manufacturing industries that things are going very well. And also mortgage rates continue at historic lows, and the Federal Reserve has indicated that they're going to show patience on increasing the federal funds rate or the interest rates there to hold up inflation. And that's something that the President has been very vocal about that he wants them to do. Some concerns. We know that we're in the middle of the longest continuous expansion in American history, and the question is, at some point, it has to stop. It'll come to an end. The question is, will it be a soft leveling off? Will it be sharp growth and leveling off to a sustainable level? Or will it be a growth to a drop like we saw 10 years ago? I think we're all hoping for it to be a leveling off and continued moderate growth. There's a question about the inverted yield curve, which is something that has been seen as being an indicator of a recession looming. Not always, but it is in the discussion. You'll hear that in the news currently. There's some concerns with the trade deal negotiations that are happening with China, although there has been some progress there. And then the USMCA, or the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement, which is the update to NAFTA, which is supposed to provide another boom to the economy as well, to increase relations between America, Canada, and Mexico. So those are things that are kind of looming that when they land should be beneficial and spur more growth. Other concerns, the impeachment, someone mentioned earlier, is kind of an unknown that could affect things. The unrest in the Middle East and the terrorist attack like we had 10 years ago could cause change there. I want to bring it down to talk about the North Carolina recovery. These are our charts of different regions around the state to show how they have recovered from the recession we had a decade ago. And if you look, this blue line is the average state growth, the growth of the state as a whole out of the recession, where this was the recession, we dipped down to the saddle point here and then began increasing. So this is the triangle there in Raleigh. This is how well the state recovered from the recession, and this lighter blue line represents how the triangle in Raleigh has recovered. So you see the distance between here is how much better Raleigh has improved or grown through the recession than the state of North Carolina as a whole has. The Charlotte region, we're part of the Charlotte region, obviously, and so we've done much better than the state on a whole. You look at Wilmington, which is representative of the beach communities. They haven't recovered as well as the state. A lot of that is affects to tourism. Their economy is based on tourism, and they've had some hurricanes down there that have hurt their growth also. And then Asheville, which is seen as more of a tourist destination, also hasn't recovered quite as well. And then down here, you see some more rural areas that have been hurt by the economy going back from losing jobs to other countries, and they still haven't recovered there. So that's just a view to see how we've done as compared to the state with our growth over the past 10 years. Then looking at Union County demographics, kind of important data points that we can look at to see how we're doing. Our estimated population in 2019 is 237,287, which shows strong growth here in the county. We're the 8th largest county in North Carolina. We continue to have that designation. We've seen 24% growth since 2009, so over a decade. And over the past 3 years, we've had growth at about 2.1%, which is sustainable, good growth. Going back to pre-recession, you may remember Union County was growing about 5.5%, which was seen as hard to manage with providing services and providing utilities to the community as it grew. But it seems that we've softened up there. We're growing at more of a manageable rate. We have the 11th highest population in North Carolina. We've grown at the 11th highest rate since 2015, so the past 3 to 4 years. We, according to the North Carolina Department of Commerce, in a report that they do called the Labor and Economic Analysis, Union County now has the highest median household income at almost $80,000 a year, which is amazing. And if you look at the top 5 counties, we're number 1, and then Wake County is after us, then Orange County, then Mecklenburg, and I think Chatham County was after that. That's a kind of bedroom community of Raleigh. So you can see that the urban areas and the surrounding areas of the urban areas have benefited more from the recovery from the recession than more rural communities have. And fortunately, we're part of that footprint. The statewide unemployment rate is at 3.5%, which is on board with what the national unemployment rate is. And we have the 34th highest tax base per capita. That's a function of population and property tax values. So that's skewed more towards smaller, lower populated counties in areas with high property values. So beach areas in the mountains near Asheville and Boone that are very desirable places to live. They're at the top of the list. That's why we're in the middle of the pack there. I want to look at some indicators that would affect our direct revenues in some ways. We know that our biggest revenue sources are ad valorem property tax revenue and our local option sales tax. We know that our property tax is driven by property values. So anything you can do to increase property values over time is going to be beneficial to our budget and our revenue streams. I took some information from the local real estate market. And I want to walk through a couple of these points just so you can see what I'm looking at. This chart here shows residential sales indicators. This one is residential inventory turnover. In this one, the orange bars represent average sales price per home in Union County. And you can see there's a gradual, significant increase over time of the average sales price per home, where now the average sale price per home in Union County is almost $360,000. And that's an increase of about $7,000 from last year. So that's a good sign that people want to be in Union County, people are willing to pay to be in Union County, and there's consistent growth happening in the county. This blue line represents days on the market. So if I list my home tomorrow, how many days will it be until an offer is made and the sale closes? Well, right now the average is 55 days. So that's a month and a half. It's trending up a little bit from last year, but it's still a manageable amount. If you look at this chart, the orange bars represent closed sales. So the total number of sales, home sales that are happening in the county over time. We can see this is also trending up. It's leveled off a little bit, and it appears to be coming up again here in 2019. And let me mention also these numbers. This is data through the end of October. So this is the calendar year. So it's January of 2019 through the end of October 2019. So this is almost a full year of information. The blue line on this chart represents inventory of homes for sale. So how many homes are on the market at any given time? Are there lots of homes on the market, so the inventory is high? Is the inventory low, so people will be bidding for limited resources and would bid the price up? Well, we can see here the inventory is coming down over time, which is it can be a function of several things. We can see that a general equation in macroeconomics is when there's a decreasing supply and there's steady demand, the price increases. And that's what we're seeing play out here. We see that the sales price is going up because there's consistent demand for housing in Union County. There's a constant stream of folks that want to come into the county, and that's causing inventory to decrease. So if that inventory doesn't come back up, then that sales price probably will continue to increase because there are fewer houses to choose from. There'll be people competing for those products with their wallets. So to me, this is a strong sign that things are well in Union County. The real estate market is moving along just fine.
Blake, can I ask a quick question?
Sure.
On that slide? Do you know when a new home becomes a part of that inventory of homes for sale? A newly constructed home?
I believe it's when it's listed when it's listed in the MLS in the real estate system. So as it's being constructed, it would be when it meets all of its requirements and the real estate agent lists it for sale on the market. That's my presumption. Good question. All right. The next one, I wanted to look at some indicators of data that we collect in-house in our building permitting and code office. And just off the top, we see the total building permits issued rose by 6.5% from 2015. So the total number of permits requested went from 3,696 in 2015 to 3,937. So that's an increase of 6.5. That seems reasonable. It doesn't seem off the charts. But if you look at the value that represents, because each permit represents a certain amount of value that is being newly constructed, maybe renovated, but will at some point become property value of Union County that will add to our tax base. So if you look at the total value of building permits issued, that has increased 62.2% from 2015 to 2019. And now that makes sense when we look back at the slide we saw before at the increasing sales price of homes over time. That's continuing to increase, and we would expect that the value of those permits would increase as well, because when you build a new house, you're permitting the value of the construction. The FY 2020 trends are very positive when you break it down at only the new permits. So new homes, new construction, maybe renovations, the value that will be added onto an existing structure. If you look at commercial, which is a smaller portion of our total property tax base, but it's still significant, has increased 177% in the first 4 months of FY 20. So from July, a few months back, until the end of October, that value that's been requested for the permit has increased 177%. Now residential, which represents about 8 times the property value of our tax base as commercial, we're highly skewed towards residential. It's increasing significantly as well, which is 35% growth over the same time period last year. So these are both very positive leading indicators for us about how our growth is going to look over the next year or so in Union County. If you look at this chart here, this is residential permits, so this is where the greatest value is in Union County. The blue bar here represents the number of permits issued in FY19 in July of FY19. Then the gray is during the same month in FY20. So it's a yearly comparison month over month to see the total number of permits requested. That's what the bars are. So you see there's some change here between the bars year over year. And that's important, but the more important part is how much value does that represent. And if you look at the bars, this represents the value. This is the total value requested through permits in FY19 through those months, and this at the total after 4 months, and this is this year. So in 19, this represented $85 million increase in value of permits requested versus this year's number, which is $114 million. So that's an increase of 35% the first part of this fiscal year compared to last fiscal year. This is where you see the dramatic increase in commercial. That's increased 177%, and these are the value numbers here. Was $31 million through October in FY19, and it's almost $86 million through the same time period in FY20. Now there's a couple of things that are influencing this. We know there's been several apartment buildings that have been requested to build, the Indian Trail installings, that's affecting this. There's some larger projects that are coming through the permitting office, which are driving this up. And also, one thing to keep in mind too is last year, if you remember, we had lots of rain in the fall, and I believe that's when the hurricane came through too. But a lot of the permits last year came in a little bit slower and really hit in the springtime. But I went back and looked year over year for the past 10 years to see, do we normally collect a straight line trending amount at different points in the year. And what I found was pretty much through the first 4 months of the year, we collect between 30 and 35% of that value and total number of permits. So even though it's not a perfect measure, it's within the range of acceptability, I think, that it is a good indicator that there is significant growth and strong expectation that will roll into the tax base at some point in the next year. This is just a snapshot of all the great work that our economic development partners are doing. Chris Platay sent me this update to show that the total capital investment in 2019 will be $277 million as efforts from their work. That's comparable to 2015, where they had a significant investment from ATI. And this is the results of this year, which, as you can see, is a great increase over 2018. And it's a function of several things: building relationships with new companies, strengthening those with existing companies, developing referrals, the Piedmont Innovation Park, and then just some good things happening where people want to invest in Union County. So that's another great benefit to show that there will be some reasonable growth to the tax base here in Union County. I want to talk about the actual tax base that we have. We see that our ad valorem revenues, so our two major revenues are ad valorem revenue and local option sales tax. Of those two, based on our total revenue stream, ad valorem represents 34.5% of the total general fund revenue. Now this is compared to in FY08, or about 10 years ago, a little more, our ad valorem revenue represented 58% of total revenues at that point. Whereas now, we can see it's decreased to where it only represents about 35% of total revenues that the county has. And we'll talk about that here in a few slides of what that impact will be. My preliminary expectation, or starting point, would be that the property values would grow at 3% for total property value. FY20, we used a growth model of 3.6%. That's where we landed last year, and the billings supported that, so we were pretty accurate. We're going to start at 3% this year, based on a couple of factors in here that we'll look at. The total the taxable property is divided into two categories. Well, two major categories between residential and commercial. We talked about that last slide. Here in Union County, we lean quite a bit more to residential versus commercial. So if there's any growth to the residential market, that benefits us more than commercial. The numbers here, these are the growth rates that I've used to use for our starting point projection, and they're reflective of the 3 prior year average growth of that specific property type. So we have 3% for residential, 3% for commercial. Motor vehicles at 4%. That was a bit higher last year based on a 10% increase from about 2 or 3 years ago. That's come down a little bit. That's a 3-year average. And then the public service property, we're holding it at no growth based on some changes that are going to happen because of the sales ratio with public service. So that ends up with a total expected growth to the property tax and penny value of 3%. So that's our start point. When we get more information in January from the tax office, from the TR1, we'll be able to look at that with a closer eye and determine if there's any fluctuation there, if it would be able to move up a little bit or maybe move down. I don't think so. But I want to start with a conservative estimate so we can, if we need to, we can move up from there. The next one is the ad valorem revenue over time. We talked about the strength of the real estate market. We talked about growing amounts of commercial and capital investment. We looked at building permits for new construction and showing solid growth. This is the ad valorem revenue in the general fund over time. We can see there's been a trend downward. Now the good news is that trend downward is not due to any external force affecting the county, affecting our property tax base. It's purely reflective of tax rate decreases that have happened over the past several years in the county, and the changes to the overall revenue as a result. And here, this represents the 3% growth start point for FY21, and you'll see here these are the tax rates that were in effect in those years. So you'll see the corresponding decrease in total ad valorem revenue with a decrease in the tax rate as well. And if we are able to maintain a constant tax rate, as the manager mentioned in his opening comments, this is where we would be for our start point in FY21. I wanted to put this here just as a reminder to show the proportion or proportionality between our major revenue sources. And we'll talk about this in a little bit when we look into sales tax. But about 10 years ago, 11 years ago, ad valorem represented 58% of total revenues for the county budget, compared to sales tax was 18%. And now ad valorem represents about 35% of the total tax set, and sales tax is 30%. So in looking at this, what we can see is that in FY20 and going into FY21, we are more dependent on sales tax than we were 10 years ago. And that's a function of the decreasing tax rate, property tax rates, and decreasing revenue in our tax set, and how that changes, how that affects the proportion. So we're more dependent on local sales tax for our revenue options right now. And we'll talk about that here in just a second. I think the next slide. One after this. So and this is a reminder of those tax rates and the changes that we've seen over time. And here you can see that some have been created new over this time period. And then overall, the total general fund, total countywide tax rate in FY16 was 87.65, and in 2020 was 73.09. Then this is the slide I was mentioning. So this is our local option sales tax. This now represents 29%. And sales tax is a very elastic revenue source, meaning that when things are good, it can be really good, and when things are bad, it can shrink, and it would leave us exposed in a position of weakness as related to our revenues if something were to happen and cause a decrease there, because we rely on that more now than we did in the past. We see now, we've talked about that consumer confidence is high, consumers are spending, savings rates are up among citizens, debt ratios are down for personal debt, so that's good, and people have confidence in the economy and they're spending their money correspondingly as a result. The general increase over time for the sales tax is about 4.5%. You may remember in the FY20 budget, we did not increase the budget for the budget amount for the sales tax because we could tell that we were going to be a little bit short in meeting our FY19 target. So we left that budget where it was, and we expect to achieve that, if not exceed it, a little bit in FY20. And so I think we'll be in a good position to go ahead and increase that budget expectation for FY21. And the average growth rate is 4.5%, so that'll be a start point to see where we are with that number. And this would be reflective of a 4.5% increase in FY21 for the local option sales tax. And if we were to go to 5.5%, if things look really positively and collections prove that out, then that would add another, say, $500,000 in total revenue we win. For every % increase in growth you show, you get about another $487,000 or $500,000 as you go up that scale. There's a lot going on here, but we'll talk about it. And this is where I talked about the elasticity of the sales tax. I wanted to go back and look at the longer history of sales tax in Union County because we're 10 years out from the recession, but it's always good to look back and see how things were affected during really bad times. Not that I expect that to happen, but it's always good to be prepared and just have important thoughts as you go forward to do your planning. The blue bar represents the total sales tax revenue in the general fund year over year from FY07 to the expected budget amount in FY20 right here. This is the population growth line over the time period. And if you'll see here, you'll recognize this as the period through which we all suffered through the Great Recession. And I just wanted to take a look and show you what the % decreases were of sales tax revenue received by the county when this was happening. So if you go back to FY08 and you see the decrease from FY08 to FY09, that was when we first felt it. There was a 16% decrease in sales tax receipts in Union County in that first year, and you can see that represented about $6 million off the table to begin with in that first year. Then if that wasn't bad enough, in FY10, it came back with a vengeance and was a 25% decrease from this already lowered amount. And so that was about $8 million there, decrease there. Then it kind of leveled off a little bit in FY11, but this was the initial loss in that year from sales tax through the recession. And again, this is what I mean when I say sales tax is an elastic revenue source, and it's not firm and constant like the property tax value is. And then just a reminder, in 2008, sales tax was 18% of total revenues, and now it's 29% of total revenues, where we're more dependent on that now than we were in the past. All right, core funding by source. Just a quick look at revenues over time. The ad valorem revenue is representing these blue blocks here. That's the base of our revenue set. The orange is the sales tax. And what you'll see over time, and these are actual numbers from FY16, that this blue section has decreased over time to reflect a smaller proportion of our total revenues. And then sales tax is increasing over time. And what's interesting is they offset each other in some ways, because the ad valorem revenue from here to here in actual collections has decreased by about $13 million, and sales tax has increased by about $12 million, so they've offset each other. The question there is, we've replaced a very stable revenue source with a somewhat elastic revenue source that if things were to change, could leave us flat-footed if something happened. So I just wanted to mention that. And the only true growth to revenue has been in net increases to intergovernmental revenues and non-enterprise charges for services. And those are not really revenues you have much control over. Those are revenues you get because of business that's being done in the county and intergovernmental transfers from other governmental agencies. Then general fund expenditures. I want to give you a quick snapshot of budget expenditures. over time. Between FY19 and FY20, the total expense budget for the county decreased 4.6%. And this is the change over time. So we see that our total expenses are decreasing. And this is a general fund adopted budget and actual budget over time. And this is the amount that has not been spent at the end of the year and would revert to fund balance. So you look, there's some variation here, but the average of these numbers over this 5-year time span is 1.5%. So that would show some accuracy in budgeting, accuracy in projection of revenue and expenses, that if over this time period we've only left 1.5% on the table in available expenses, then we're running pretty close to the line there with our expenses. Now I want to get into, look at all that information that we've talked about from the national economy, the state economy, local drivers of revenues, and see how that would affect our budget assumptions for FY21. We talked about the ad valorem growth. The expectation would be that the start point would be a 3% growth on ad valorem. And again, that's compared to 3.6% growth that we used in our calculations last year. And 3% would be a start point to see how we can fare in January going forward. And again, each percent growth to the ad valorem rate would draw about another between $500,000 and $600,000 in total revenue. Sales tax, 4.5%. We talked about that. And that would add about $500,000 also with each percent increase. The other revenue sources are calculated based on trend. So if you've seen trends of increasing or decreasing revenues, they've been adjusted based on that. And the expectation would be for fund balance appropriation that, as a start point at least, we would only budget fund balance to offset the obligations for the economic incentive grant contracts that we have. And we try to begin the year without using fund balance as a revenue. Then the expenses, we know that salary benefits, we're starting with a 3% of merit for employees and annualization of positions. Health and dental, we would start at 5% growth based on expenses. There will likely be a change in funding for OPEB, which would still keep us in our required annual contribution, but would free up about $2.5 million for use in other operations. There is a true increase to general fund debt service this year of $4.6 million. I know that Jeff has done a lot of work to try and come up with a plan to offset that so that didn't grow in the general fund budget and compete against departmental services for funding. And I think he's been successful with that. Then PAYGO, the concept last year was to have a level loading or level funding for PAYGO going forward. Prior year amount was $4.2 million, and we have that budget as the starting assumption to keep it there. And a few other things that would be important for FY21 expense budgeting. Again, this is the fund balance concept I talked about to start with without using fund balance as a revenue. We've discussed having a board contingency, which would serve as an option for emergencies or alternative funding that will come through the year where now if something comes up, fund balance is the immediate place to go to meet those needs. In the past, there has been a board contingency, which would be accessible to the board or the manager as those things come up. So that's in there as a placeholder, but it's not necessarily guaranteed. And then other revenues based on trend, we would assume no FTE growth at the start point. Any new positions would be a true enhancement request, or we term an SL3, and then SL1s, which is your base budget, and SL2s, which would be add-backs. So when you take all of those starting assumptions for revenues that we talked about, and you balance them against all the starting assumptions for expenses we talked about, that leaves you with an initial projected revenue in the general fund of just over $170 million, or 1.5% total growth in this amount. And on the expense side, the expense is expected to be just over $171 million, which is a 2% increase in expenses at $3.4 million, which leaves a gap. So the starting point would be a gap of expenses over revenues of about $800,000. And now this includes the expectation that we'll be able to offset the growth in general fund debt service of that $4.6 million. if that were not to be a reality or couldn't be achieved, then this number would not be $800,000, it would be $4.6 million plus $800,000, or a negative position of $5.4 million. So that's going to be a big benefit if we can offset that growth in the general fund debt service. So last year we implemented a concept or a methodology of target-based budgeting, where we look at total revenues expected, total expense expected, and then see what the gap is. Last year we had a gap of about $3.5 million, and so the departments were given a target to build their budget to, and they were asked to build their budget to a starting point, which is a decrease of 2% to their total expense budget. This year, our gap isn't quite as severe. It's just $1 million at this point. It could change, but right now it's $1 million. So in order to use the target-based methodology again, we're asking departments to reduce only their operating budget portion by 5%. So we've gone from 2% to 5%, but the 2% was of total expenses, and the 5% is only of their operating budget, which is the only portion they really have control over anyway. And so it's a little bit easier to understand, I believe. So if these conditions prove true, then this would give the manager about $170,000 to start with for any enhancements, any position enhancements, any vehicle enhancements, any enhancements to service delivery. So that's not a lot of wiggle room there to start with, but that would be based on our starting assumptions. This is where we are. This is a look at our budget calendar. We began our budget process back in November and working with our community partners to open up that process of them requesting funding. We had a budget kickoff meeting on December 3rd with all of our departments to walk through the assumptions that I shared with you now and their target-based budget process that we're going through. And they're going to have, the budget system is now open for them to work in, and they're going to have 2 full months between now and the end of January to build their base budgets and build out their departmental requests to be considered by the county manager. And then this would come down to being balanced, hopefully with the manager recommended budget in April, and looking towards a presentation of the manager's proposed budget in early May, and then adoption shortly thereafter. That's the long-term goal, and there's lots of pieces in between there. Are there any questions or any thoughts before I go to the very last portion?
Blake, has there been any thought given to policy ideas or anything on that with regard to that change in property versus sales tax ratio there in terms of long-term? Seems to me you have potential for some unsustainability there if you continue on that path.
I think the reason I bring it up is to just, not because I expect something bad to happen,
Sure.
but just to make everybody aware so that we can start those discussions. I don't know that, I haven't initiated those discussions outside of this group at this point, but it probably would be a good.
I think we plan on bringing that up as a topic of discussion at one of the work sessions.
Okay.
Later on.
Good.
And that'll be part of what Ed gets doing that.
Great. Anything else before I move on real quick? Okay. I want to share with you. I'm going to show you some dashboards that we've created. So this is a concept of performance management. And several years ago, probably 3 to 4 years ago, the finance office and budget office, before I came here, went through a rigorous process to restructure the chart of accounts, or the accounting system and the budget structure in the county. And they did that to build a performance-based budgeting structure, so you could link activities or efforts within departments to budget that's being spent on those efforts. So you could build out performance measures to see how much money we're spending on each specific activity that happens within departments, and then measure to see if they're being effective in their customer delivery, if they're being effective in their management of county resources, if they're being timely in service delivery, or how they're doing, build out a work plan for departments and for departments directors to use in managing their focus and checking on their results, and also setting targets for them to achieve to work towards doing great things here in the county. And this is a product that we've newly procured this past year that would be able to create a dashboard for each department director on the key data points that they really should be focusing on, whether it be revenue, expense, key data points for what their activities are. It would be updated on a monthly basis, and then they could refer to it to see where they are on achieving their targets that they've set forth, and then approved by the county manager. And so I want to show you real quick. We have a few examples built out, and we're in the process of working towards this and seeing if we can move ahead with this concept. So what you see here is, this is the OpenGov dashboard. And you can see each of these squares or tiles represent KPIs or key performance indicators of departments of their regular activities that they do. And I'll choose a public health dashboard. Each tile is a representation of their results, of how they're managing. So if you think about it in your vehicle, on your way over here today, on your dashboard of your car, you got several important things that tell you vital information about your vehicle, right? They tell you what your speed is, tells you what your gas level is, tells you what your battery power is, if your engine's overheating or not. And each of those individually are important to the success of you getting from your house to here safely and then back home again. And if you see one of those change on your way, then you know you need to take action to get it back to a successful level. If you see your gas light come on, then you know I need to start looking for a gas station to get to refill my gas. If you see your check engine light come on, you need to make plans to go to the mechanic. If you see your oil light come on, you need to get your oil changed. Same thing with this. This tile here is a total revenue for public health, and it's broken out by month, so they can track month by month how their revenue collection is over the previous year. They can see what percentage of total budget they've collected and what percentage is yet to be collected. They can compare that with previous years to see if they are above trend or below trend on the revenue collection, and if there's anything that they need to do to affect that. If they see they're falling behind, what can they do to get it back up where it needs to be? This is revenue, this is expense, and this is the same thing with expense. You see we're about halfway through the year so far, and this speedometer or gas gauge shows that their expenses are about halfway expended through the fiscal year. So they would be on trend for their total expenses. Then the others are unique data points on whatever their business is that they're doing to show them what their progress is to date. So one of the things that public health does is they do home visits for newborns. You can click on this tile, and it should come up. Let's see. It allows departments to drill down and see what those results are on a monthly basis, and to see if they need to take action. The computer's a little slow, but I'll go back. And here we go. So this one was newborn home visits. This one is number of inmate sick calls. We know that inmate health is a big expense in the budget, and that's driven by the number of sick calls that happen. And the health department could look at this and see if there's a cyclical nature to that, to see if there's something that happens month over month that they can affect, or if there's a better way to manage that number. And they would have this updated on a monthly basis. And the same thing with number of dental visits to see how the dental clinic is progressing over time there. This would be built out for the public health director, and then there would be another one built out for the county manager to see all of the important key performance indicators across the county, including revenue and expense, and then performance measurement as well. So I won't go through the other ones, but I think you get the idea of what it is. And we're working towards hopefully building this out by the end of this fiscal year, so we can begin FY21 with the dashboard system to benefit each department director as they go forward and set goals for their achievement of their departments for that year. So that's all I have. You don't want any more. All right.
Very good, Ed.
Alrighty.
Thank you, Blake. I actually enjoy seeing economic presentations. I don't know if I'm the only one in the room, but I find them quite interesting, especially when the numbers are trending up and you're seeing a lot of positives like y'all have in the community. What I'm going to be working through today with you all is the PowerPoint that is the other handout that y'all have in front of you. Literally everything that is in your on the presentation is in your handout, so you won't have to take a lot of notes based on what you're necessarily going to see in this handout. But the PowerPoint slides are listed here. I will tell you that we'll go through one activity which has an attachment at the very back of your handout. So when I refer to the program listing, it's the very back page, front and back in your handout. Okay? But in terms of what we'd like to talk about today, this is fairly similar. And let's see, Blake, do you have the remote? Oh.
Should be on the.
Oh, I see. Okay, thank you. This is going to be a fairly similar workshop to what we had the last couple of years, but it's going to be a little bit shorter, a little bit more concise, just because we've worked through a lot of mechanics in the process, the budget process over the last couple of years. Actually, the first and last items on this agenda, Blake's already taken care of, so this is the part that I'll cover with you all today. We're going to go through the themes from the interviews that we had with you all, those one-on-one discussions that we had, and thank y'all again for the time. I mean, it's very beneficial to myself, to the budget staff and leadership to really be able to talk to you one-on-one and answer some of the questions in preparation for not only this workshop, but the budget process coming forward. We're actually going to spend most of our time on these 2 bullet points, reviewing the strategic objectives, and then addressing some of the budget topic areas that y'all want to focus on during this budget year. And then we'll briefly touch on some of the decision-making criteria for some of these evaluations that you might do or the staff might do for additional expenditures on enhancements down the road, just kind of refresh on those, and then just refresh on some points that y'all brought up during the workshops as well. But I'm actually going to spend just a brief time on this slide. We usually spend a lot more time because there's a lot more details to address in terms of what came out of the interviews with you all. But this is fairly consistent from board member to board member in terms of some of the common themes. Last year's budget process, people generally feel like it went pretty smoothly. You all felt fairly positively about it overall, so that was definitely a plus. You liked having the budget workshops prior to the board meeting, same day. That was useful, particularly if there was some kind of significant change or milestone, something important that required that meeting. That's beneficial to have those workshops. There was some sense in some of the interviews that you all would like to see a little bit more information, particularly about the why of some of the requests. There were some comments that were made that maybe you did have enough information to make the decisions you needed. Some of the information you received, however, might have been a little bit granular, a little bit too detailed on the budget items. Instead of that, you definitely want to know the rationale behind the request. Several members said, we talked to our community constituents, and they wanted to know why we're spending money on A versus B, so being able to articulate that back to them, understand the why behind the what is beneficial to you all. So learning a little bit more about that. We did talk about the Union County Public Schools engagement process. Generally speaking, you all felt positively about it. The meetings were helpful. You learned something from those meetings. A couple of the board members felt that maybe because of the venue with the joint meetings, that particular aspect to it may have restricted some of the folks from being as open as they would be otherwise, but yet having that meeting, having everybody in the same room, having that conversation overall was beneficial. And then we are going to talk about topic areas, some of the common themes when we asked what do you want to hear more about for whatever reason during this budget process. We'll talk about those specific topic areas in just a minute. But any comments or questions that you all had as it relates to the common themes coming out of the board interviews? Okay. Mr. Aitmus, anything in particular? Okay. I'd like to spend a good bit of time talking about strategic objectives. These objectives, and I know Blake reviewed them briefly before he led into his presentation, these objectives help to not only guide you in your decision making, but staff as well. I know the staff are asked to look at when they're making requests or enhancements to say, how does this particular enhancement or this request address the strategic objectives of the organization? So it's important that these strategic objectives are your strategic objectives as the board. So we want to make sure we're reviewing them. If we need to make any refinements, make any additions or changes, that we can do that as well, particularly to give the staff the kind of direction that they need. My understanding is that these were actually developed many years ago before virtually all of y'all were on the board, and therefore, again, we want to make sure that these are reflective of your goals, your priorities. So we're actually going to look at these objectives in a couple different ways. The first way we'll do it is we'll literally look at them and then we'll just refresh everybody on what the objectives are. What are some of the key points or takeaways on each one of these 5 objectives? And then we're going to make sure that they do reflect what your goals, what your priorities are as well. So I'm going to tap your brain a little bit on, are these the priorities you're looking for in your role leading this organization? We're going to ask if there's any key objectives that are missing. For whatever reason, they're not there, they're not called out as overtly as you would prefer them to be called out, so we'll talk about that as well. And in the end, I'm actually going to make you do a little bit of wordsmithing. I'm going to ask you to look at these in detail and say, is this worded, is this articulated in the way that you want it articulated to your staff, so that they have the kind of guidance they need when they're determining their funding approaches and their enhancement requests. So these are the 5 strategic objectives. I won't read through them in detail, but I do want to highlight a couple points on each of these. So public safety, there's a key section of the public safety definition. It talks about protect. So when this definition was created, it talked about protecting, and that related to public health, safety, and welfare. In community consensus, there were 2 different pieces associated with this definition that I'd just like y'all to focus on. One was the programs you deliver. That was a part of this definition, that you are developing and delivering programs and services, and those are being developed and delivered to reflect the community priorities. So there's 2 different pieces to that community consensus objective. It's that there's an assumption being made that you all are very aware of, clear on what your community wants, and then you feel comfortable that this organization is delivering the product, services, programs to meet those community wants and needs as well. The third item is economic development, and there's 2 different components under development. It's the development of qualified workforce, and as well as infrastructure. It deals with conservation of resources so that we can make sure we're sustainable for the long term as we're delivering these services and these programs. And then organizational strengthening. It talks about employee investment, the importance in doing that to enable these programs, these services, this action to take place. And when we talk about investment, it's investment in tools for them, training for them, resources for them as well. So just kind of looking at these 5 objectives, this will give you a little bit of a feel for how they were defined initially. I'm going to ask y'all to kind of take a slightly different perspective on these, and focusing on obviously the 5, but the areas that I highlighted as well. Because sometimes just looking at 5 objectives like this, it's not clear how they tie together. So here's a very simple graphic that might help us to illustrate what these 5 objectives are doing. Essentially, with sustainability and organizational strengthening, you are saying that part of your role and part of the responsibility for this organization is to manage resources. And there's kind of a balance here in how you all are suggesting that you and the organization manage resources. One, you want to be good stewards of the resources, of the finances of this organization, of this community. At the same time, you want to make sure that the organization is strong enough so that it can succeed. It can take action, it can build the quality of life that your community wants. So one aspect of what these objectives state is that part of your role, this organization's role, is to manage resources, balance being a good steward, and balancing enabling the success of this organization. That being the case, if we manage resources well, the next step is to actually take action. And that action can be grouped into these 3 different buckets. 1, we're protecting. 2nd, we're delivering. 3rd, we're developing. So when this organization takes action, it is trying to protect the community, the health, the well-being, the safety, while the organization is delivering services. We are protecting the community, the environment, etc., while this community is being developed. So this is a second major role that's conveyed through these 5 strategic objectives. And then the third role is obviously to achieve the desired outcomes. Remember, under community consensus, it talked about 2 different things. It said, first, we understand, we know what the community wants, and second, we're delivering the services to address what the community wants and needs. So, in other words, community consensus implies that we understand how the community defines the kind of quality of life that they want, and therefore, through managing resources, through taking action, this organization is doing what it can to help the community have the quality of life that it desires. So this is just another way to think about how these 5 objectives work together. You're managing the resources to take action to achieve desired outcomes. So I'm going to kind of pause there, and just at a high level, when you think about your role, when you think about the role of this organization, before we dig into the 5 individual strategic objectives in detail, does this reflect what you all view as your role, the role of this organization in terms of serving the community? Mr. Helms?
Yeah, I think it does. I mean, we can clearly take some actions that'll make us more effective, but that's kind of the target to, and I'd say transparency is probably another word that would be beneficial in how we deal with the community.
Okay, all right. Mr. Rushing, thoughts? Is this reflective?
Say it again?
Is this reflective of how you view your role, the role of this organization within the community?
Yeah, I don't think we're doing it, but that's how I do my role.
Great. Commissioner Simpson?
Yeah, I think so, in a global sort of way, sure.
Okay, yeah, we'll get granular in just a minute, but that helps. Commissioner Ray?
I like what I see. I think we've made great progress this year. As I told you in my breakout session, I just wanted to see more of the same this year.
Okay. And then, Mr. Akins? Okay, thank y'all for that. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna pass around a sheet. It's actually something you already have in your handout. It's the prior slide. If you could take one and just pass it around to you, that would be great. And basically, I'm going to go to the next slide, which is just a repeat of the strategic objectives. And I want us to think about these. The reason why I'm handing that out is I'm going to ask you to do an individual exercise in just a minute. But there are 5 different strategic objectives. We talked about how they're weaved into those 3 major purposes: managing the resources, taking action, and achieving the desired outcomes. And the way the strategic objectives were worded initially is, again, we have public safety, community consensus, economic development, sustainability, and organizational strengthening. Is there anything, when you start looking at this level of detail at the objectives themselves, that is missing in terms of what you all view your role as being, or the role of this organization being? Is there anything that's not covered or is not overt enough in these different strategic objectives?
We probably need to outline for Public Works what they feel like the future of Union County should be.
So Public Works.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And then what the future would be. So,
And what's their vision for the county?
okay, and that might relate to some of the topics that y'all would talk about down the road that the county manager alluded to as well. Other things that are not overt enough in terms of these broad-based objectives for the organization. Mr. Ray?
Public safety, what I see is a breakdown in moral values across America. And it's costing every county, every state more and more to protect the citizens. And much of it goes back to the prescription drug crisis that has created a group of dependents that are having trouble functioning in today's world, and it just taxes our law enforcement to deal with it.
Just looking at some of the societal issues that can cause and a burden for some of the public safety needs. Okay.
I mean, the economy has recovered greatly, but also it seems home break-ins seem to be increasing, just violence in general.
Okay. Anything else that y'all, when you look at this and you think about your role, the role of this organization in serving the community, that is just missing there, not called out overtly enough, clearly enough? All right. So that being the case, what I'd like y'all to do is to actually spend a couple minutes now, and I'm literally going to give you 2 to 3 minutes individually, and just look through the details of the wording on these 5 strategic objectives and see if there's anything you either have a question about or you want to change. Keep it in mind that we want to make sure that these objectives are reflective of the guidance you want to give staff when they're thinking about, okay, I need to align my expansion needs, my enhancement needs to the objectives of the organization, anything you want to change or modify in any of these strategic objectives. So again, I'll literally give you 2 to 3 minutes, just quietly, to do it individually, and then we'll do a debrief on that. Okay. Looks like y'all are about done. Would anybody like an extra minute or so? Commissioner Ray, are you about ready? Commissioner Rushing? What I'd like to do is just literally go down through these one by one and just talk about them a little bit. So with public safety, it says in concert with our community partners, provide those essential services that protect the public's health, safety, welfare. Does this appropriately reflect how you view your roles or any change you would make to that?
Well, when I was sworn in, Sheriff Kathy told me my first priority was the protection of the public and their safety and health. And he grinned when he said that, but
About that.
it is our number one goal.
And that definitely shows the importance of making sure these are reflective of your priorities, because, you know, he is directly aligning with that. Any other comments? Commissioner Sim,
Go ahead.
Commissioner Helms, did you have something?
Yeah, I'd say these are very much interwoven with the needs when you talk about public safety. We got to also talk about our sustainability. You know, there are needs in our public safety that we still have to address, and I think we've all talked about that. That goes back to some of the basic needs. Is, you know, we've talked about fire. We've got fires on the table right now, and we all know that environment's changing. So we need to address the changes that are coming, and they may be financial, they may be manpower.
Yeah, that's a good point. There's an inherent link, somewhat of a handoff between what we looked at on the prior page, where we're talking about the services we provide, and then making sure that we're able to sustain those for the long term. We're giving them the resources they need to succeed as well. So any specific changes? Commissioner Simpson, anything you'd like to share on the first one? Does that accurately reflect the key
I
objective?
don't think so. I was at that first meeting. It was in this same room when we had school of government go through this process the first time. And we identified public safety as a priority. And I think we've done a good job of that. Commissioner Helms makes a valid point that we've seen changes in emergency medical services, we've seen changes in fire service, and we're going to continue to see changes as the community evolves, and as Dennis raised the issue with regard to some of those issues he mentioned. It increases the responsibilities and issues that our law enforcement deal with. So it's a broad brush, but it's a priority, and certainly, I don't know that the intent was ever to list them 1 to 5 as to which is the most important and the least important, but certainly that, to me, takes precedence over all the others.
And this has pretty much been a community for years, that you really didn't lock your car doors, didn't lock your house doors, because there was nothing to worry about, but that's changing.
Why don't we go on to community consensus, unless Commissioner Rushing, anything to add on that first item?
Again, I'm concerned that we're actually trying to get to these objectives when we look at protecting the public health, when we look at a good portion of the county doesn't have access to reliable water resources. You have, even in our house, our water supply source has been regularly going away and having to be supplemented somewhere else. We have community priorities I don't think are being reflected by the decisions that we're making. Economic development, the infrastructure capacity is fantastic if it's just not affordable to the rest of the county. And then affordability of services and conservation resources. We're requiring our citizens to conserve water based on an agreement that we've made to do that, not because that the water has to be conserved. And the organizational strengthening, we're doing a great deal of that. I think we're shifting a lot of money into part of our organization. So 1 out of 5 ain't bad.
And I think as you work through those 5 different objectives, I think that's why this is so important, because this enables evaluation points. If these are the objectives, then how are we doing on public safety? How are we doing on community consensus, economic development, sustainability, organizational strengthening? It will eventually tie back to the individual department or agency that Blake was alluding to. Because when he was talking about department dashboards, he was talking about performance. What should happen is that eventually overall performance is evaluated, funding requests are looked at through this lens. If this is your set of objectives, how are we performing on these? If there are funding requests, how do they align to these? So this kind of serves as a litmus test for those kind of performance evaluations and decisions. Yes, sir?
I think we need to add, for community census, I think we need to differentiate between our constituents and our municipalities. Sometimes we don't think about our municipalities as being constituents, but they are, and we need to have that cooperation. I have to commend the manager. He has gotten out and interfaced with our communities, and I'm getting extremely positive feedback from their councils on how we're doing. I think we need to continue that, and I think having it identified here might help them understand that we are serious about working with them.
Would that be something, would it be appropriate to add in, whether it's engaging stakeholders, we could note other municipalities there, or reflect the community and municipal priorities?
Like that. It's a two-way street. It's not just us, they've got to
Sure.
talk with us, but we need to let them know we want to have that communication, want to work in the best interest for all of us.
Okay. Maybe better reflected than talking about stakeholders, and engaging the stakeholders. So we can reference the municipalities, call that out after stakeholders. One other point that you made, Commissioner Helms, when we were talking earlier, talking about transparency. I mean, obviously that could apply to all these, but were you thinking in particular that that was something that needed to be called out a little bit
Well,
specifically?
that's kind of what I'm
in
saying.
consensus?
We need to maybe add a little bit of specifics of what we're looking at.
Okay.
I agree with Commissioner Rape. I think we've come a long way this year, but we need to continue to focus on it.
Okay.
One clarification, just about this exercise and the importance of these strategic objectives, because in what hasn't been said, it's been alluded to, but it hasn't been said directly, is when departments and agencies come with their funding requests that are expansions. So we have the SL1s, which are your area business as usual today, but then there's an expansion, there's an SL2 level and an SL3 level. And when they get into those SL2s and 3s, in their request, they have to justify those as to how they fit into these strategic objectives and add to them. So are we actually focusing on the priorities and the objectives that the board has given us? You know, how are we doing that? But that goes into that process, and then through the management team's review of that, we look to see, you know, exactly what kind of impact that funding request will have. So it is an important part of the budget review process. Just wanted to
Thank you for that.
tell you, you know, sometimes we go through a activity like this, and sometimes in the back of our minds, we wonder, you know, what's the purpose? Well, that's one, I can tell you, the management team's looking at this, and we are filtering it through this lens, those funding requests through this lens, so.
Thank you for sharing that. And regarding transparency, I know we're doing a little bit of wordsmithing, but we could essentially say here, by developing relationships based on mutual trust, transparency, and understanding, then we would engage appropriate stakeholders such as residents and municipalities, you know, something like that, if that would work for you all. Other thoughts on community consensus? Mr. Rickman?
Covered it.
What about the next item? We have economic development. I know that's something that's going to come up in a slide or two when we talk about specific topics for your information sessions for those budget workshops. But just from a definitional standpoint, is this reflecting a key objective you have for this organization? Yes, sir.
Ed, the one thing that has amazed me in the past 12 months is we have had a tremendous economic development in Union County. Chris Platay and his staff has done excellent. The thing that surprised me was the low number of jobs, but you know, I'm coming to realize everything is automated and robotized, and I probably butchered that word, but
It's a word.
but in other words, they'll spend $100 million and add 20 jobs. And I realize you can't have your cake and eat it too, and the economic development does add to the ad valorem, but the kind of businesses that are growing in Union County are they're not menial jobs, they're high quality jobs that pay great salaries. But when we see $120 million economic incentive grant, it may only add 30 jobs, and you think, wow, this is not like the old cotton mill days and stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely the mix of businesses across America has changed
I don't think they
dramatically
exist
from
anymore. I think
30 years
everybody's been forced to streamline their production.
Yeah. Any other comments or modifications y'all would make to the definition of economic development? Okay. For sustainability, again, we have the entire definition, but some of the key phrases, affordability, conservation. Any comments or changes to that definition?
Well, I think there what we have seen is Jerry, what they call it in agriculture, horizontal.
Vertical integration.
Vertical integration, yeah. In other words, Duke's Mayonnaise bought an existing empty meat processing plant, and they're bringing in stuff that they can use from across the street at Tyson Foods, making chicken salads and pimento cheeses and stuff like that. So the growth we've seen is going to be tied to something that's already in Union County.
Okay, that's interesting. So it could be with suppliers who are joining.
Or getting closer to either their source of goods or raw materials, or their end users of raw materials.
Yeah. Any other comments on sustainability?
I'm sure Chris and his crew are doing this, but Richard made the point about municipalities. one size doesn't fit all, and Waxhaw's vision or Indian Trail's vision may be totally different in terms of what they want their business community, their commercial community to look like as compared to Monroe or something.
Yes.
So we need to be supportive of a variety of workforce development as opposed to, say, just focusing on manufacturing.
Yeah, and that's interesting because that goes back to this point that was made earlier. By calling out municipalities, it's not just a matter of what does Union County as a whole need, but what are the unique needs for Waxhaw versus Weddington versus Monroe, et cetera. And then how do we make sure that we're supporting whatever those unique needs, whether it's qualified labor, how they define it based on what their economic base is in terms of companies and jobs is. So that just brings up the point that is good to call that out separately when we're talking about community consensus, because it informs a lot of these other points as well. Okay. Anything else prior to talking about organizational strengthening? All right, for organizational strengthening, does this reflect your goals, your priorities, how you would define organizational strengthening, that we're talking about employee investment of tools, training, resources that support skills development, knowledge sharing, retention as well? Is that organizational strengthening to you? Commissioner Akmus, is this how you view it in your role here for the organization or just business in general?
Yeah, so.
Well, I think our management team has done great to reach out to the organization and kind of empower them. I know one thing that comes to mind was the $1 million idea at the 12 Mile Creek sewage plant, where somebody on staff figured out how to solve a problem that was supposedly going to cost us a bunch of money. And I think the management team thanked them, rewarded them, made them know that they had really helped the whole county.
That's great. Commissioner Helms?
Goes back to my upbringing in business. I'm retired IBM. One of the main things that made that company great for so many years was respect for the individuals. And I think we are demonstrating that. That's what Dennis was just describing, but it might even be beneficial to identify respect for our employees, our organization, as part of our goal. I think that is being done now, but
So through shared values, including mutual respect, clarity of purpose, something like that. Commissioner Rushing, anything you'd like to add regarding organizational strengthening?
No.
Okay. And Commissioner Simpson?
I don't think so. Richard makes a good point. Call it the whole person, to not only train them to do the job, but to respect their personal goals and family life and those kind of things. It's important.
Okay. Well, from what we've talked about, these strategic objectives seem to reflect largely what you all are looking for as well in terms of what this organization is responsible for, what it does. We do have some tweaks with community consensus. We're making sure we're articulating where it says appropriate stakeholders. We'll reword that or add wording after that says appropriate stakeholders such as residents and municipalities, so that when we're working through, for example, qualified workforce, we're thinking about how the unique needs of each municipality are reflected in the workforce that we're developing. Under organizational strengthening, we'll modify that slightly as well through shared values, including mutual respect, and then keep what we have reflected there as well. There are a couple of other points. Public works, I know that is something that will be part of, I would assume, topics that are addressed through the budget process. Societal issues, I think public safety, that might be something that they might already have on their action plan or something to consider. What is driving the need for heightened public safety resources? what are some of the root causes of it, such as the societal issues that you're talking about. And then public safety as it relates to fire, we'll talk about that in a minute as well. Also in terms of, some of the topics to address that came out of some of the board interviews. So that being the case, it seems like these objectives hold really well for y'all with those modifications that we put on the flip chart. Is that an appropriate stopping point for the discussion on strategic objectives? Does everybody feel confident?
One point, I think these apply to every department in Union County, no matter public works, the general population of our employees. I think it applies to everybody. You can't have different rules for different departments.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point. It kind of piggybacks on what Manager Watson was saying about how the finance area, when they're doing budgeting, they're literally using this as that litmus test to say, how well does this really reflect, how well does your request, your need reflect what the organization's priorities are. So any other comments on that point? Okay. What we're going to do now is move on to another discussion that's budget related, maybe a little bit less strategic at this point, but talking about budget topics. And we had some conversation about this with you all individually, and just to kind of review what some of the areas were that were mentioned multiple times. Economic development, when we had our interviews, was mentioned multiple times. Y'all would like an update on that, in particular how things are going with the Union County Industrial Park. Capital funding from a couple different perspectives. Y'all would like an update on that through the budget process, as well as any operational impacts from these capital expenditures, what they might be, so that you're looking at down the road what are the expense implications of the capital investments. Fire, getting updates on that. We've already talked about that a little bit. In particular, I think Blake may have alluded to that. And then the 2021 revaluation, obviously it's a little ways away, but that was something where it's what effect it could have on the budget process, on funding, and on all sorts of different factors and communications. That is something that y'all would like to talk about through this budget process. At least having a common understanding of what some of those budget effects may be, what kind of communications might be required that relate to that 2021 revaluation for, I guess, the 2022 fiscal year. So those four being called out, are there additional ones just off the top of your head? We'll go through an exercise in a minute, but any others that go off the top of your head that you want to make sure we're talking about, or any clarification you want to add to some of these particular budget topic items? We'll look at these in more detail in just a second. One item that staff suggested was possibly providing during the budget process an update on Behavioral Health Collaborative, which I believe was done last year as well. One question we had, the Union County Public School joint sessions that were held last year, we already talked about them a little bit. There was a sense that you liked them, you thought they were positive, you thought they were useful. Some folks might hold back a little bit during those meetings, but it is good to get everybody in the room. There is some learning that happens going back and forth. So we're curious if there were to be another one or maybe two joint sessions with Union County Public Schools, what are some of the key items that you would want to learn through those sessions? What might be some key topics of conversation you would want to have, or you'd like to hear from the board or from the staff at Union County Public Schools? Anything in particular pop to mind? Commissioner Simpson?
I think I mentioned this a couple of times previous, but I think it was maybe our first meeting or maybe last meeting last spring, they gave us a 2-sheet capital fund of all the numerous projects that were going to be coming in the future, short term and long term. And it may be a good time to delve down into those a little deeper and a little more detail.
And Commissioner Rushing, I know we had talked a little bit about capital funds or capital needs from the school system during our interview. Anything you want to add to what Commissioner Simpson said?
I know there's been an interest for the last few years to get started on projects in the summer when the kids are out of school. And I think that the way we do our budget probably is counterproductive to them being able to do that. We need to figure out some other way that they can get started on those projects in the summer rather than having to wait for approval in July.
So how to enable the schools to start on capital projects during the summer.
But I think those discussions need to be starting now instead of May and June. If they anticipate work that needs to be done over the summer, because he brings up a valid point. So, I mean, we need to be planning and understand those needs, and then we can evaluate whether or not the funds are available to make them happen in an appropriate time frame.
All right, that helps. Thank you both.
In the 2 years I was there, what was glaringly obvious, the budget year doesn't wrap up till June 30th. And you're already almost a month into the summer vacation. And under state law, they can't do anything until they have the funds available to do it. They can, they can get estimates, but what they really need, I guess, would be part of their CIP money to where they could start developing it, so they could have projects that need to be done over the summer ready to start the last day that staff's at the school. And that just can't happen under the current framework that we work in.
So that's something that maybe in conversations with y'all better understanding and earlier understanding their capital needs and working with finance, maybe there's some opportunities or processes that can be identified to address some of that. So that's helpful to know. Other points that y'all would like to learn through conversations with the schools. Anything else? Okay. The last point here talks about the program listing. If you turn to the last page in your handout, it's actually a front and back document. And this is very similar to what we have reviewed the prior year. And essentially, you're going to see several different columns. This is just a larger version of what you all have. You'll notice down the right-hand side, it has reference numbers, and I believe it's 1 through 42 that you all are looking at on page 1. And then you're looking at 43 through 82 on page 2. And essentially, this is just a list of all the different programs, the different agencies, the different leaders of those respective areas. And what I'd like to do is literally just give you 2 to 3 minutes to look down this list, both page 1 and page 2, and just to see if we're missing anything. When you think about what you want to learn more about, hear more about during this budget process, during these budget workshops, beyond what's up here on the slide, beyond what we've talked about and noticed here for Union County Public Schools in the flip chart, are there other areas that you want to make sure that we're discussing during this budget process? So I'll give you 2 to 3 minutes, and then I'll ask you which reference number and which program that you're interested in addition to these. looking, feel free to keep looking. I'm curious, when you are looking through the list, are there any of these that, for whatever reason, we haven't chatted about yet, but you want to make sure there might be some workshop agenda items for y'all to discuss? Anything else on the list that comes to mind? Mr. Aikman? Anything? Okay. Mr. Rushing? We're good?
I'd like to see and maybe it falls under one of these, the Board of Commissioners. I mean, we're a department as well, and and we do have budget needs, so.
Any others? Commissioner Raitt? Commissioner Simpson?
Be very thorough.
The only point that I just want to reiterate, Manager Watson brought this up earlier, that y'all might want to look at that mix that Blake pointed out, the mix of the ad valorem and the sales tax, and just learn a little bit more about that, and that might be a topic for y'all to consider. So that revenue mix and how it's changing. So make sure that that's addressed at some point with a topic information session.
Since you bring that up, we've already mentioned it, what about the issue we just talked about with the schools? Is that a specific enough topic to explore? From the standpoint of some funding mechanism to be able to get them out of the ground sooner?
Oh, yes, sir, I'm sorry. Yeah, well, that's a good question. We talked about this item, determining how to enable Union County to start capital projects, so that could be a topic information session, so that's a good point. So I'm going to, just so I can cross-reference this, I'll add this as well. So,
This past year, there was a case of with that, Jerry, painting a lot of the older schools that hadn't been painted. They were clean, but they had old paint, and that's something you pretty much can award the contracts one day and the contractors can start the next day. Stuff like that, they need help freeing up that money.
okay. All right, that sounds good. So the budget topics will include these items, those over there. The third item for UCPS being this whole conversation around the funding for those capital-oriented projects. So in terms of just kind of doing a quick refresher for you all, this is something that you developed back in 2017. We just refreshed you on it on 2018 and confirmed that this still met your needs, and then we're just kind of reiterating it and refreshing on it again this year. But one thing we asked was, beyond the strategic objectives, if there is an enhancement request in particular, where somebody is really requesting additional funding for a particular program or an enhancement of service, what are some of those, you could call them KPIs, key performance indicators, or community or internal impacts that you want to make sure you have some sense of before approving some of these enhancement requests? And this is something y'all came up with in 2017, that if a given department or agency or program is saying, above and beyond our normal budget request, we are requesting this enhancement, you would like to see, well, how does this improve the level of service or the quality of life, or impact the whole community, the whole county, not just one small particular area of the county? Is this addressing a need that's voiced by a large section of the community, or again, just a little subset? You'd like to know that. And then, will this result in the education of the public in some manner? Or, instead of just looking at the community impact, is this enhancement request from departments having some kind of a benefit internally, such as, does it improve timeliness of service or efficiency or performance in some way? Are there redundancies eliminated? And what's the ROI? So this is just kind of a refresher, along with the strategic objectives. A little bit more tactically, these are aspects of the enhancement request you'd like to see addressed. If somebody is requesting additional funding above and beyond, whether it's for additional staff or expansion of a program or whatever the case might be, you'd like them to be able to also articulate in a little bit more detail how this positively impacts the community, or how this is going to positively impact internal performance. Okay? So again, this is just an FYI. It's something you requested a couple of years ago, and it helps staff, again, to know when they are saying this is an enhancement we have, this is explaining that why question that y'all are seeking more information on this year. Why is this particular request needed? Okay. Any comments on that? All right. Just a couple additional points that came out of our one-on-one interviews, and these are considerations for the budget workshop presentations. Y'all suggested that you want to keep these budget workshops the same day as the board meetings. During the workshops, again, you wanted more detail on the reasons for the request, the rationale behind them, maybe slightly less on the less significant, the smaller budget items. And regarding budget updates to the board, we asked you if you wanted ongoing updates. There was some mention of maybe having some kind of an email update periodically, but you didn't want to necessarily schedule budget updates just to schedule them. You only wanted to have updates on how the progress is going. If there was some significant topic for staff to bring to you, there was some significant change to be conveyed. So it's kind of an as-needed update just on how the budget process in general capacity. So those is going. So in terms of where we'll go next with these agenda items, we'll obviously compile the information like we've done the last 2 years, provide a summary to management and staff. And then obviously the approach to the budget process will be modified to incorporate the topics of interest. The strategic objectives will be modified as well so that staff can begin planning for the work sessions as well. So this is all we had planned to cover. Before I hand it back off to Commissioner Simpson, or if any others would like to ask any questions or make any comments, feel free to do so now. Anything you all want to talk about before we wrap this portion up? All right, I'll hand it back to Commissioner Simpson.
Thank you very much, Ed. It was a great process, and we look forward to continuing to move forward with this year's budget planning. Blake, thank you for all your input. Feel like I can handle the Federal Reserve now after all that information. Andrew Watson, anything you want to comment on?
I was going to say, we really appreciate the feedback today. I look forward to getting Ed's summary so we can incorporate that into the budget calendar. It's really good to know what the board likes out of the process, what you find helpful, and the decisions that you have to make. That really is helpful to us. And some of these items that you've added for specific workshops, we already have some ideas about those, so we'll be glad to schedule that and share those at the appropriate time.
Great. Again, thank you for your time. Hearing no further business, I'll offer a motion to adjourn. All in favor? Thank you.